Is the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
That's a press conference from U.S. President Joe Biden just weeks ago, not months or years ago, but it was just last month, where he swore on a stack of Bibles that, oh no, those Afghan military forces are serious and well-armed and well-trained, and there's 300,000 of them. They're going to hold off the Taliban who are outnumbered and outgunned. No, pay no attention to increasing reports from the intelligence community that the country is crumbling and that it could fall. No. Well, it was short weeks from that to this. These are terrifying scenes as the Taliban close in on Kabul itself, the capital city where so many thousands of Westerners, Americans, Canadians, Brits, and others, were there either in a military or a quasi-military or a civilian capacity, 20 years rushing to the airport, reminiscent of the fall of Saigon in Vietnam when the North Vietnamese finally closed in. Everyone who was associated with the American regime then was in grave trouble for their lives. I think the same is obvious in Afghanistan. If you cooperated or collaborated with America or Canada, you may face death. And the scene of the hasty retreat, including these terrifying photos of ordinary Afghans literally clambering onto a U.S. military jet. Look at this. I don't know what they were thinking, but they must have been so desperate to think that it's better to hang on to the outside of a jet than to be left behind to the devices of the Taliban. What an utter humiliation and a disaster. A loss of blood and treasure for 20 years. And now this disgrace in the eyes of the world. Joining us now to talk about it is our friend Joel Pollak, Senior Editor-at-Large at Breitbart.com. You know, Joel, it's great to see you. Thanks. I've been following you on Twitter on this issue. Let's unpack the two things, the actual cost and loss of blood and treasure and the loss of military equipment. Here's a parade of high-tech U.S. equipment being sent to Iran, where it'll surely be shared with China and Russia. Just the loss of money and life, but also the loss of stature. Talk about that.
Well, Ezra, there are two dimensions to this. One is the overall long-term strategic dimension, where Americans have become tired, both Republicans and Democrats, of a long-term commitment to Afghanistan, a country that seems incapable of governing itself. And the frustration with the government of Afghanistan is bipartisan. People do feel that 20 years is too long to have troops committed there, not just to provide security, but also in combat roles. People are tired of the war. People are tired of the expense. And they feel that the people for whom this is being done are ungrateful. So there's a general fatigue with Afghanistan, and you saw it under President Donald Trump, who said he wanted to withdraw, and of course with President Joe Biden, who has withdrawn. The difference between Trump and Biden is really about tactics and how the withdrawal is going to take place. Biden has shown that he is willing to accept, in Neville Chamberlain's terms, peace at any price. So he didn't really care how the withdrawal was done. He was simply going to withdraw. With Trump, we saw that he was only going to withdraw from a position of strength. When he came to office, he talked about withdrawing, but he also dropped the Moab, the mother of all bombs, on Taliban complexes in the country. And when the Taliban started to attack Americans during the talks in September 2019, Trump suspended the talks and said there will be no further negotiations while the Taliban are killing Americans. Trump made it absolutely clear he was not going to withdraw under fire, which is why it took so long to get out. Trump also set a May 1st deadline to leave. May 1st is, of course, the anniversary of the killing of Osama bin Laden by Navy SEALs. Joe Biden changed that to September 11th. Now, September 11th is a very weighty day in American history, and it's a sacred day in some ways, but it's also a day that marks an American defeat. It marks the day, of course, when thousands of Americans were killed by terrorists who had been harbored by the Taliban for years. Biden essentially marked this withdrawal as a defeat from the beginning, and he gave the Taliban all kinds of extra time to prepare. and he completely eviscerated his own deterrent ability. He took apart the American deterrent. So he was negotiating from a position of weakness, just as he's negotiating with Iran from a position of weakness, just as he has given away almost everything Russia has demanded. And that's the posture of Joe Biden. He has extensive experience in foreign policy, but as Sarah Palin said in their vice presidential debate in 2008, he's always been wrong. There's almost no issue in foreign policy on which Joe Biden has ever been right. And he thinks he's a genius. So when the generals told him this was going to be dangerous, evidently from what we're hearing, he overruled them and said, no, we're just going to pull out. Trump clashed with his generals, but he also listened to them. And even though he drew down forces significantly, he did it in a way that did not jeopardize American security. The broader issue is really we have China ascendant, not only because we've now withdrawn our troops from the one country with a land border with China where we had a base, but also because China is now going to move in and do deals with the Taliban and gain access to the rare earth minerals that are abundant in Afghanistan. Russia is now crowing over this because they had their own defeat in Afghanistan under the Soviet Union, and they're now being seen in the Middle East as a more reliable ally than the United States, at least under Democrats. And Iran, of course, is thrilled because Afghanistan borders Iran, and they're now getting all that military equipment you talked about. Plus, they are given a reprieve here. Trump had Iran on the ropes. The regime looked weak. Biden has given them a third chance on life. The second chance, of course, was given by Barack Obama. So this is a catastrophe. And what has to be done now is, first, there have to be rescue operations to bring the thousands of Americans, thousands of Afghan allies out of the country. We also have to consider the other countries who were with us in Afghanistan. There's a lot of consternation among American allies, frustration that Joe Biden didn't consult with them about this. So we have to correct that situation immediately. Second, there has to be a more aggressive and assertive posture on all fronts in foreign policy. We need to make clear that we are going to protect Taiwan from China. We need to make clear that we are not going to accept a return to the failed Iran nuclear deal. We need to make it clear to Russia that we will not tolerate aggression in Eastern Europe or anywhere else. In short, we need to reverse all of Joe Biden's foreign policies thus far. And we also need to see resignations. Secretary of State Tony Blinken must resign. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan must resign. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has to resign. The Press Secretary Jen Psaki has to resign. She was AWOL during this entire crisis. And we also need to see other resignations, including the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who is so busy educating his troops about white rage and critical race theory that he failed to make adequate plans for the Afghan withdrawal. So that's the situation we're in. It's not unsalvageable. We can do it, but we need a drastic change of personnel and policy.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.